let me just say, there are no high throughput blockchains today. There are extremely low throughput blockchains and maybe some moderate throughput blockchain.
Low latency, low jitter networks are table stakes for high performance. They're not the killer app, they're not the differentiator, they're table stakes.
We're just starting to see in some situations on-chain pricing be as good as centralized exchange pricing. And it should be the opposite. We should be giving much better pricing on decentralized markets. If these markets can have more information, if they can move more quickly, they have all the building blocks to outcompete their centralized competitors, except they're all running on a fundamentally problematic base layer. And that base layer is not Solana or Ethereum, it's the public internet.
Austin, Mateo, thank you so much for hosting me here in Miami, in my hometown. So appreciate it to both of you.
No, our pleasure. I lived here for more than 10 years full time, and it's my second home. So happy to be back here in Miami. And we exposed you to some pretty cool stuff this morning, I think.
No, it was great. I think this morning we got to tour one of, for me, my first data center, but it was one of the largest, correct me if I'm wrong, data centers in south of the United States in terms of connectivity and stitching bandwidth. And honestly, I had kind of a preconceived notion of going in, but it was a really cool experience getting to see the data centers, the racks, and even the fiber optic cables coming up through the floor. It was a super cool experience, so thank you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and Austin had that same first experience when he first visited me down in Buenos Aires when we started the project, and I really think it's like a rite of passage for anyone who wants to understand how the internet works, to actually peer into the internet, to see what creates this internet. And the facility we visited, called the NAP of the Americas, it's also an Equinix building here in Miami. It's the fourth largest internet exchange in the world. A lot of people will be surprised. They're like, wow, Miami has the fourth largest internet exchange in the world. That's a little bit strange. But if you think about where it's located geographically, it is at the intersection of so many regions and oceans that all of the subsea cables come in from Latin America, from the Caribbean. There's cables that go up to the north of the US, all coming into Miami. And so I wanted you to see that, because for the past year, you've been asking about DoubleZero, what's under the hood, what is this whole infrastructure thing that you guys are bringing into crypto, and I wanted you to see it live.
No, thank you. Again, it was a super cool experience, really unique to actually, I think you commented, you can actually see and touch the internet, which is true. Can you maybe, for the people that don't know what interconnects are, kind of share a little bit more about that? So I don't know if there's as many networking people. I think more are coming now into crypto, but maybe not as much as people don't know as much as probably they should about on like bandwidth and packets and kind of where we're probably going if we are kind of going to maybe resemble high frequency trading. So can you share more about just what an interconnect is?
Yeah, I was actually comparing it to a train station when we were there in the data center tour, and saying, like, you guys are looking at Grand Central Station where all the trains are coming in on the tracks and meeting in a central platform. And that platform is the internet exchange, where all of the internet service providers peer with each other, exchange all of their traffic. If I think you're asking me about, like, take it all the way from someone's house into the place that we were looking in the middle of a data center, what you have in your house are called eyeballs. These two eyeballs at home looking at a screen on the internet. And all of these ISPs, the internet service providers, have a number of eyeballs connected to their network. Those are all the subscriber lines going to our houses, or to our cell phones. And those eyeballs are going to look at things on other people's networks, on other people's eyeballs. So if someone on Verizon publishes a website and someone from a service provider in Miami wants to see that website, they need to peer together to be able to exchange that traffic. And so do you want to have everyone doing peer-to-peer? We've all heard of peer-to-peer. there are gonna be millions and billions of individual connections. It's much more efficient to bring everyone into a central location, a big data center room, and allow them to all peer together and create that.
Yeah, and maybe it's helpful to sort of think about how these systems evolved over time, because a lot of the properties of how they're designed today actually go back to like the telephone system, and the idea that like we don't have enough telephone lines for every person to have a line. Instead, we have a switchboard. And if you see in old videos of people, patching one thing into another, like that was a physical switchboard back in the day. Then we switched to virtual switchboards. But like the whole point, if you grew up watching Cold War movies about like the red phone, the dedicated line from DC to the Kremlin, is there's no switchboards in between. It's one piece of cable effectively that runs from the White House to the Kremlin. So if you pick up the phone, you're directly connected to the other person. That type of direct connect system is not how the internet's built, because it's just as Mateo was talking about, that would be a massive peer-to-peer network where my house would need a direct connection to Mateo's house in order for there to be direct routing. So instead, you have individual networks, right? This is sort of how these things start out. You have like one network covering, let's just say, Georgia and like the southern coast of the United States. You have another network in Mexico or in Argentina or Brazil or Chile. And eventually you have to say that, exactly what Mateo was talking about, how do you move data from one network to another? And we just sort of might casually assume that like, well, there's just a bunch of places that data is exchanged, right? Of course, like there's all these on-ramps and off-ramps, and it must just be sort of everywhere that data moves freely between places. But there's a lot of reasons why, and Mateo can get into this, about why historically they did not get built that way. And so you have these buildings, like these physical, like it's a building, but it's not that big of a building. It's like smaller than an Amazon warehouse at the end of the day, where you have all these different fiber lines meeting and data gets exchanged between different network providers. And that's like the power of the public internet today, is that this is this fairly free exchange of information. What you sacrifice for that free exchange of information is direct routing. And so when you look at how these systems evolve, you have these like points in the world. And this is, as Mateo was saying, one of the 4 largest places where these fiber cables peer of anywhere in the world is in Miami. This also means that 70% of all the traffic for Latin America flows through that one building.
It is pretty crazy. Prior to talking about recording the podcast, we were kind of looking back at or chatting about some of the history, and we used to have all these debates about decentralization and crypto, and it was like, all right, should they run these blockchains run on Raspberry Pi? Should they run on like 25 megabits, 1 gigabyte? Like when Solana moved to 1 gigabyte, it was like everybody kind of put their hands up and was like, hey, that's not decentralized. But I think to your point, or both of you, like if 70% of South America's traffic is running through one spot in the United States, you take out that spot. I think you joked, Mateo, if you blow up that spot, then a lot of the traffic in South America would ultimately be out. And from the blockchain standpoint, if you can't communicate with other nodes, then you're ultimately cooked, no matter how many nodes you have in that part of the world. So,
and that's what we saw with the AWS outage in the Northeast region recently, is you had this huge node that everyone was connected to. It went down and it caused a big problem. And so I promised, as we were like getting warmed up here, that I would weave my intro into the storytelling here. And so, as you may or may not know, Austin and I are co-founders of DoubleZero protocol together with Andrew McConnell, who is here. We're doing a team offsite, and we left him in the room with the whole team going through our GitHub repo and came here to talk to you. But the way I got involved with the building that we visited today is that I was working for Global Crossing. I was leading a region for Global Crossing that included the South Florida region at the time, early 2000s, and we were building a subsea cable system up from Latin America to Miami, and then up to New York, and then across to London. And we needed to land it at a major internet peering point. And we made a deal with the NAP of the Americas, with this building that we went to see. Said, well, if you're already going to be peering here and having all of these ISPs come in, why don't you make it a global node on the internet instead of just a regional US node? And that is what made it the fourth largest IX point, because we brought in these international subsea cables. And that's the second part of the answer to your question about tell me about these interconnects. So we talked about peering, but in order to have peering, you need to connect a bunch of cables from all over the place into that one location. So the Global Crossing cable came up from Brazil. It went from Rio to Sao Paulo to Fortaleza. And then it went through the Caribbean, through the island of St. Croix, and stopped there to be regenerated, had 2 cable stations on the beach, and then it came up to Hollywood, Florida, and down to the Napa of the Americas. And as I was working for Global Crossing, I was responsible for that region. One of my first work assignments was go to St. Croix and explain to all of the angry business people there why this massive submarine cable is coming right through their island and not giving them any internet access. And it was I was a young executive at Global Crossing. I hadn't had that much experience, and I certainly hadn't had that much exposure to an angry mob. And so I flew down to St. Croix. I had the really good fortune of actually watching the cable being landed by divers who bring the cable off the ship. They attach it to the ocean floor, being careful not to disturb any coral reefs or any turtle habitats, which is very sensitive, especially in the U.S. Virgin Islands. They had people monitoring and making sure that there were going to be no oil spills, no affecting the wildlife. They bore the cable through the beach. They bring it up at the cable station. We saw this whole thing happening, and then I went to the local resident town hall meeting. And they were very angry, and they were saying, why are you doing this to our island and not benefiting us at all? And long story short, at the end of the meeting, with no approval whatsoever from Global Crossing, I promised everyone that I would make them have access to the Global Crossing cable, and that we would somehow get them capacity because their internet service sucked. And eventually, through many subversive acts, I was able to make that happen and to get a drop in St. Croix for those residents. And at the same time that we were fighting those battles, we were bringing this connectivity into the Napa of the Americas. And so when you think about our argument, you may have seen other podcasts that we've done about DoubleZero. Our argument is that the internet routes ineffectively. And as we were all sitting there or standing there watching this peering take place in one of the biggest places in the world for traffic to be exchanged, I pointed out that it has a magnet effect. Basically, all the routers all around Latin America and all around the south of the US, they want to send their traffic to that peering point because it is inexpensive. There's free peering there. They don't have to pay transit to other ISPs. And it is the next hop for many large edge routers because it's such a huge presence. The engineers build it that way. That's the easiest and cheapest place to go. And so if you're trying to go from Chile to Argentina, it would be ludicrous to go to Miami first. But many times that is exactly the route that the internet will choose. If you're trying to go from Atlanta to New York, it would be ludicrous to come down to Miami and then go back to New York. But the internet does use that route. And so what DoubleZero does is it breaks that magnetism, it removes that magnetism, and it makes everything point to point between the 2 points that are most efficient on a straight fiber route. And so it was really important for me that you sort of experienced why the internet routes inefficiently, and that is the main reason, these huge access points.
I wish we could have taken video and actually gone and shown the data center, because it is really unique. I wish everybody could have gone to go see it.
Yeah, it's I think what you're struck by the first time. So the first data center I visited was down in Buenos Aires, and this was where you have all of the internet for the entire country and a few surrounding countries, right, coming in through this one. And you think about like, oh, I'm going to go see where the internet for this entire country comes in. You think like it's going to be big. It's not big. Like even this massive peering point we visited,
I've driven by that building many times and I had no idea that was in
not
there.
only is that building not that big, right? Like a Costco is bigger than that building. But like it is about the size of this room. The actual peering points where all these fibers actually meet. It's not like, oh, its entire building is peering. We'll get into what the rest of the building is full of. But it's like a small portion of one floor, and there's two redundant systems next to each other, and each one's the size of like a large like living room and dining room. They're actually not that much physical space because at the end of the day, you're connecting fiber to routers, and you know the magic is not in the physicality of these systems. I mean, it is in the physicality of these systems, but they don't require massive, large pieces of hardware to accomplish that task.
It is interesting. I mean, from the blockchain standpoint, we used to argue about like, is megabytes too much throughput for blockchains before kind of like the high throughput blockchains of today. They had to be kilobytes. But now you guys, or the network is generally continuing to add 100 gigabyte lines, which is massive and a lot of throughput. I don't know if any blockchains are doing that, but then yet.
No, I mean, let me just say, there are no high throughput blockchains today. There are extremely low throughput blockchains and maybe some moderate throughput blockchains.
I would agree with that. I think, I mean, I always hated this analogy, but it was like the dial-up and then broadband and then fiber. And I mean, maybe we're in broadband. I don't know if we're in fiber yet, but I do think this is kind of the next logical step within that is once you start moving up the stack, adding more throughput is cutting down on the latency as well. And I think maybe that's the hard part that people have maybe understanding about DoubleZero is like why latency matters. And for me, the most relevant was kind of like studying Flash Boys and going down like the high frequency trading route. And I know, Mateo, you spent a lot of time thinking about trading and building different trading systems. Maybe for the audience watching or listening to this podcast is talking about how ultimately trading systems focused a lot on latency.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions or rumors about trading is that latency is the only thing that matters. And the message that I've been telling and trying to spread about latency is low latency, low jitter networks are table stakes for high performance. They're not the killer app, they're not the differentiator, they're table stakes. And so a lot of times people say, well, I need to measure the impact that low latency is creating on my validator or on my application. And I say, well, that's nice and you can measure it, but that's not the question. The question is, can you achieve high performance if you have high jitter and high latency? And the answer for distributed systems is always no. And the way that blockchain got around it is by building in all of these layers of protection and duplication and replication. And that all caused this huge overhead in performance that we're now fighting against today. We're coming in here saying, we know how to build performant networks, and we had to team up with someone like Austin because otherwise we wouldn't know what the hell is going on in blockchain to explain to us how all of these layers of replication and duplication came about. Because for us, from building financial networks or normal corporate networks, we don't understand. We just build direct point-to-point dedicated lines that are low latency, low jitter, and the applications that you deploy on top of those work great, and you have responsiveness, you have great UX, you have everything working great. And we need to create that, we need to make that happen in blockchain, and that is why, we're talking about protocol stuff now. That is why we're talking about things like Alpenglow on Solana. That's why we're trying to accompany blockchains in improving their protocols to take all that overhead out and focus on high performance and be able to get the benefit that low latency and low jitter brings.
It was actually one of my favorite conversations that I've had in the space was when I flew down and chatted with you in Buenos Aires, because you came at it from such a different angle, where you came at it from the networking stack. And I felt like it took me, I studied engineering and computer science and ultimately did product, but it took me probably a year and a half to kind of understand like blockchain architecture-ish, and that we needed to evolve from like these lower throughput blockchains to higher throughput blockchains. And I kind of came at it from a completely different angle, but I feel like ended up at a relatively similar place, where it was much more focused on the product standpoint and what you can ultimately deliver. And that conversation that we had in Buenos Aires, I was just so enlightened, because it wasn't about blockchain, it was just about networking and building great systems. That it was a lot of fun just to see how you approach it. But I very much echo those statements. It's now trying to build better products and make sure that kind of the decentralization aspect kind of remains, but that doesn't get in the way of building like better products that we can do with these decentralized networks.
Yeah, I want to talk in a minute. I want to talk about the centralization, decentralization, infinity loop, because I've been very entertained by the crypto debate on centralization and decentralization. But first, I'll finish answering your question about latency, because as you mentioned, I had experience. I worked for high frequency trading firms, or at least I built networks that they used. And a lot of people think still today, that if you have the lowest latency link between an exchange and your terminal, or between an order book and your terminal, that you will win all of the trades. And that may have been somewhat true at the beginning of the latency arms race, when people weren't expecting it. But today, trading algorithms expect you to have low latency and expect to be competing against people with low latency. And so it's table stakes. You come with the lowest latency links between exchanges, and then the people that win are the people with the best trading strategies, combined with the lowest latency, combined with the amount of input and feedback they give their algorithms. I'm hearing from some of the traders today that they're like educating and providing feedback to their algorithms multiple times a day, when in the past you didn't have to update it so frequently. So again, yet another industry similar to content delivery and streaming video, similar to online gaming, that you must have low latency and high quality networks in order to play the game. And that's the narrative change that I'm trying to influence in Solana, in blockchain in general. It's not like, well, what do I get? What do I get with low latency? It's like, no, if you want to play this game, you must have low latency.
I mean, in that standpoint, I mean, we've seen block times with Ethereum 12 seconds, and then blockchains kind of went to 1 second, and it was like, that's magical. Solana got to 400 milliseconds. I think Aptos now is at 80 milliseconds. I think we're trying to get down to like sub 50 milliseconds across blockchains. So trending in the right direction, but probably slower than we would like.
Yeah, I mean, another way to think about this is like, what did we get as a world from the rise of low latency centralized trading? Because there's kind of a narrative out there that like, oh, it's bad, right? Like that's like a common narrative, maybe not in crypto circles, but like the idea of like an HFT firm being like a positive thing in the world is usually not a common. If you poll the average person, I don't think they would be like, man, Citadel, they're doing God's work.
Yep.
But you look at what we've seen over the last, let's call it 10 years, of the rise of fintechs that offer zero fee trading, that offer all of these products that used to have $20, $10, $5 trade fees attached to them, have effectively zero fees. And they also are able to operate much more advanced financial products, support a much broader category of assets. You can buy $1 worth of something on Robinhood. Like, all of that access comes because you have these high frequency trading networks that are optimizing markets for such low spreads that you can get really good pricing instantaneously on stuff. And this is partially the exchanges, we're involved in this too, but a lot of this has to go with just the sophistication of trading. And we're not there in crypto yet. We're just starting to see in some situations on-chain pricing be as good as centralized exchange pricing. And it should be the opposite. We should be giving much better pricing on decentralized markets. If these markets can have more information, if they can move more quickly, they have all the building blocks to outcompete their centralized competitors, except they're all running on a fundamentally problematic base layer. And that base layer is not Solana or Ethereum, it's the public internet.
Yeah, and now I promised I'd talk about decentralization, centralization from an outsider's perspective, because everyone in crypto is so engaged and hotly engaged in this debate because it touches belief systems, right? And when you have belief systems that somebody comes in and recklessly challenges on X in public or whatever else, it's explosive. And the reason I'm sort of having fun is because I'm also an economist, and I've studied the history of markets and the history of governments. And you can see that this happening over and over again in history. It becomes centralized, it blows up, it's corrupt, it's wielding its power irresponsibly, and so all of a sudden it becomes fully decentralized, and then it becomes centralized again. And so that's the centralization decentralization continuum, and I call it an infinity loop because it just goes on and on like an accordion. Centralization, decentralization, and we're seeing that play out in fast forward in crypto right now, right? Because where in a country or an economy it could take centuries or decades, in crypto we're seeing it happen in a few short years and go from decentralization maxis to all of these centralized exchange solutions, and then people say, oh wait a second, there's a lot of bad stuff happening there, let's go to some hybrid decentralized model. And we're, as network builders, we're sort of watching this play out, and we're saying you can have it all. You don't have to be one or the other or something in the middle. Just focus on your application. What do you want to build? One of the things that DoubleZero talks about a lot is we're non-prescriptive neutral infrastructure. We're not going to tell you what to build. We're going to lay it out so that whatever you do build works well and works responsibly. And so we have people that are talking to us about, hey, can you do this super centralized sequencer that's really ultra fast and give us timestamps, and as if that were something revolutionary, that's just how traditional finance works, right? And then you've got these others saying we're a super global decentralized network, and we want to have protocol improvements so that we can have inclusion at the edge of the network really fast, and we can actually act on that in real time. Well, that's pretty cool, but it's not that revolutionary because that's exactly how HFT networks work. They have these distributed global networks throughout all the exchanges that matter all around the world, and anytime anything happens at the edge, that signal automatically gets picked up, put into the logic, into the trading logic, and acted upon from a number of different centralized compute nodes, right? And so all we're saying here is let's implement those same two models at high performance, but put all the good stuff from blockchain into that. Put the consensus layer in, put a lot of the protections that are in there, a lot of the economic interest protection that's in their economic security. And so from our perspective, what we're building, and I'd like to hear Austin kind of re-describe it because I love it, but what we're building is fairly simple when you think of it as something that's already been done, redone in a new way that incorporates the crypto philosophy into it.
Blockchains definitely have a very religious aspect. Even I think Ethereum really, since 2023, maybe that's changed now with kind of the rise of Solana again, really had the best researchers and a lot of intellectual talent. And I always thought, more from a religion standpoint, that they weren't going to able to kind of build a more high throughput network, not because they weren't smart, it's just they didn't want to from kind of the religious aspect. But it is interesting that it's cool to see all the different kind of blockchain designs. You have L2s, which are kind of giant if you push them hard enough to like almost like New York Stock Exchange, where you have co-location, you have sharding, which are kind of like, you could kind of think of them as like different exchanges around the world that have different prices, and then you have to aggregate all those prices together, and then you kind of have the high throughput blockchains. And we're trying all the different variants to see what works, but it is interesting. We're just kind of speed running a lot of the traditional finance stack and what has historically been built.
Yeah, the history of Ethereum is really interesting to me, because usually when you see like an incumbent fail to respond to a changing market, it's because the leadership of that thing, usually a corporation, like is blind to it, or they've entrenched interests that. But what we saw with Ethereum was like a wholesale embrace. Like there's no leader of Ethereum. Yeah, there's people with more power than others, but it's a pretty spread out, democratic, like laissez-faire like collective of organization, however you want to refer to it. It's not a company where there's a boss. Like Vitalik can say a bunch of things, but at the end of the day, like sometimes people listen to him, oftentimes they don't. That's the hallmark of decentralization. And it was a whole group that all convinced themselves that there was one right way to do this and nothing else could be done. And what we've seen with the rise of L2s, like the early L2s took their centralization as something it felt like they were embarrassed of.
Yeah.
You know, like they were like there's major L2s that to this day hide the sequencer. They sort of obfuscate where it is. They put it behind a bunch of load balancers, and they don't tell you where it is. Like, and of course, traders spend a lot of time triangulating it, and they know exactly where it actually is, and because they have an economic incentive to. But then you have new networks, new L2s that are coming up that basically say, hey, our sequencer is right here. Here is the exact server and the exact data center of where this thing is. Come trade on it as if it's a centralized exchange. Because from a technology, set aside the regulatory question, from a technology standpoint, it is a centralized exchange. It's one or two servers in a specific location that are processing data. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But it's really interesting that we've crossed this chasm a little bit where L2s are like, no, we are unabashedly a centralized actor. Now, maybe they're trying to get to a stage 2 roll-up so they can't actually steal user funds, but they've sort of stopped. I don't mean that as a dig. I mean, they are really trying to get there, but, we don't have any stage 2 roll-ups in production today. But the whole point that they're trying to get to now is, like, if you look at the way Mega ETH talks about itself, they're not pretending that there's some abstract system behind it. They're like, yeah, there's a server architecture, there's node specialization, it'll be located in this data center. Like, if you're trading on it, like, come co-locate with this. And then you have the distributed networks like Solana and Aptos and Sui that are still point source markets, right? Like, you think about this as, like, from a market structure perspective, what is like NYSE, or what is like a centralized L2 that doesn't move? And it's a market expressed in the case of NYSE, like maybe 500 by 500 square meters. In the case of an L2, like maybe 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters, right? The space between the CPU and the RAM and the NVMe is like, that is physically in the world where that market exists. On Solana or Aptos or Sui or Monad, any fast L1 that builds one block at a time, you still have a point source market of like 10 centimeters. But it moves around the world every 1.8 or 1.6 seconds or however it is for other blockchains. And so you still have this point source market that keeps moving. I think the really interesting test will be Solana having multiple concurrent block producers. Because suddenly you take one point source market and you create 2 point source markets. And so what is the average size of a 2 point source market that is perfectly distributed across the world? Well, it's half the size of the Earth. And so now, like right now, there are economic reasons to co-locate in like the European Triangle on Solana. And it's like a problem, but from a decentralization standpoint. The minute that you have multiple blocks being able to be built at the same time, suddenly decentralization becomes an unquestioned advantage over a point source market. Because let's just say we only had 2 locations blocks were being built. It was all Amsterdam and it was all Singapore. Well, if a news event happens in Hong Kong and you're sitting in Hong Kong as a trader and you're, well, okay, I have a trade I need to make because something big just happened. It's much faster for you to send that data to Singapore than it is for you to send it to Amsterdam. And so suddenly the decentralization of Solana means that that trader in Hong Kong may be able to actually get a trade in on Solana before they could get the trade in on the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. And that's really interesting because suddenly we have a system where you can have global markets that have the performance as if they're more like regional markets. And that really, that grand vision, whether that is multiple L2s that are all sort of like multiple point source markets that you can arbitrage between that are run in different parts of the world, or whether that is sort of Solana having concurrent markets that move around the world, or something else that someone hasn't even invented yet, those are all very credible takes on how decentralized systems can outperform centralized systems. And to date, decentralization has always been a trade-off. It's always been a trade-off in the negative side. I am accepting worse price, worse execution, and worse liquidity for like black swan downside protection. And what's a black swan downside protection? FTX. The idea that this venue that I'm trading on is actually deeply fraudulent, or Mt. Gox. It just gets hacked. And at that point, like, yeah, there's a lot of people who are at fault for that, but you know, what can you do? And that trade-off has always been one about safety or privacy or some sort of very ephemeral, squishy value system that an individual has and says, this value system is worth me losing out on some economic opportunity for. And the cool piece is, I think that era is probably starting to end.
Yeah, I agree. I think we were building crypto products just for the sake of crypto products before, and now the focus is just definitely on just net better products. Like you remove crypto, like crypto hopefully is an implementation detail or part of the product, but that's not first and foremost like why you should actually use the product. The product should stand on its own 2 feet. But to your point on like the whole multi-leader and L2 thing, it's been super interesting. Even like my old podcast with Toli, I go back and watch him sometime, just how directionally correct he's been with a lot of the blockchain aspect. We were talking about multi-threaded versus single-threaded, and that was a big debate back in the day. Talk about...
And sorry, I have no idea why these things were ever debates. One of the things that consistently surprises me about crypto is that people can hold opinions that are completely illogical and they can feel like they're being internally consistent to themselves.
To me, it just goes back to the religion aspect.
Yeah, it's a belief system.
Yes.
Absolutely. And when you look at some of these technologies like that are debated, and people that build the networks are like, that's not a debate, that's just a necessity. Another one that we can talk about, and is a differentiator for DoubleZero, is multicast.
Yes.
Because people say, well, why do I need to use a dedicated network? You say, well, because that's how performance systems do it already. That's how TradFi does it already. You say, well, no, my beliefs are different than that. I'm not that. I'm this over here. Can you make that happen in my world? DoubleZero is here to say the answer is yes. We can make that happen in your world. And that's what's so hard about our project. That's the hard part, is how do we take something like multicast that is part of is a major component of performance in traditional finance exchanges. How do they get the data out? How do they ingest market data? How can we make that work in a blockchain environment on a blockchain? And so that's been a large part of our development over the past few months. We've been talking about it here in our offsite, in our engineering whiteboard sessions, is like, how do we take that and deploy it widespread in Solana, in other blockchains? And the reason that it is a differentiator for DoubleZero is because the architecture that we've implemented is an overlay, a mesh overlay on top of dedicated fiber on a single autonomous system number, single ASN. And so what that means is that the DoubleZero network is a single network that is comprised of multiple pieces of fiber, multiple point-to-point links, that has a single brain, has a single network controller that is able to route traffic in that single network. And that means that we can have these multicast groups active in the network and that they can be seamless and be global. And so if you say, oh, well, who cares about DoubleZero multicast? You say, well, you could say that if you're a centralized sequencer, but if you're a global decentralized blockchain, global multicast is the killer app. I mean, it literally changes everything, because all of that overhead and complexity that I was talking about at the beginning of our talk can be taken away because you no longer need to replicate packets from the source.
Can you explain what multicast is before we go too far into the multicast rabbit hole?
Yeah, sorry. I remember I was telling you earlier that my son always tells me, like, can you actually explain things instead of just talking about them? Okay. Yes. So at the most simple level, if I am throwing a packet at Austin, and it needs to go to both you and Austin, and Austin has a switch sitting right in front of him. In a unicast world, I would need to throw 2 packets, one to each of you directly. And in a multicast world, I could just throw 1 packet to Austin. He could just drop it on top of the switch that's right in front of him, and the switch will create a duplicate packet and send it over to you. And so basically what it means is that you push all of the traffic replication out to the furthest possible point in the network. And what does that mean? It means clean pipes on all of the stuff that's all on this side, right? So basically I'm saying I'm only going to send 1 packet to the next location, and that next location is going to replicate however many it needs to send to the next 3 locations, or however many. And so the way blockchains solve this is by creating these trees, these distribution trees with tons of packet replication, because the transmission medium is lossy and has jitter and has inconsistencies, and so I might lose packets all over the place. And so I need to just send out not only 1 to everyone, but why don't I go ahead and send out like 20 or 30 to everyone, just in case we lose some.
Yeah. At its core, multicast is hardware acceleration of packet replication.
Yeah.
It is the ability, and you've probably run into some version of multicast in your daily life. Yes. If you are sending a AirPlay stream from 1 phone to 6 speakers in your house, that is using multicast. Now, that's using a very residential, low-grade version of multicast, but it is the same kind of technology. Multicast is used in tons of different types of commercial settings. It is, it's probably most famous in the high-frequency trading world, where, like, not only are the price feeds you receive from exchanges on multicast, but you are often multicasting the trades that you make out to let all the other trade servers you run and all the other exchanges know, hey, like, I just traded this thing on New York Stock Exchange. Trader in London, you may want to know this too. But it's also used in automotive systems. A ton of different ways multicast is actually employed, because it's this idea that instead of having to send data multiple times, you can only send it 1 or 2 times, and that will cover all the places it needs to go to.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Is it more about like packet efficiency in terms of like you're literally sending less data, or what's the...
There's a lot of advantages. So data efficiency is one. So you take the hypothetical example of 999 validators in New York, 1 validator in London. In a unicast system, like Solana and every other blockchain today is, if that validator in London builds a block, it has to send 999 copies of that data over the Atlantic to get to those 999 validators in New York. On a multicast system, it sends 2 copies of the data. 1 is primary, 2nd is just a backup feed in case something goes wrong with the primary one, and that's it. It just sends 2 copies across the Atlantic, and then the switch on the receiving end replicates that data and pushes it out to all of the places it needs to get to. And so there are massive bandwidth savings, but there's also a lot of fairness that gets built into these systems, right? And this is something we forget, is unicast systems, there's always a choice about who gets data first and who gets data last. And that may not seem like much, but when you're talking about Solana, where there's 7,000 places data has to get to, 1,000 consensus nodes and 6,000 RPCs, if you are number 1 or number 7,000, that's a meaningful time difference. And so what multicast does is it eliminates that. So on Solana, what they do is stake weighted. So the Helios validator gets data more quickly than the Coinbase validator, which gets data more quickly than the Bonk validator. And you can go down the list, and by the time you're validator 800, you're meaningfully behind the tip of the chain. And that matters if you're trying to build a block. You actually see the further down the leader schedule you get, the higher the skip rate goes on the first block that they build, because sometimes they just don't have the data to build the block. But if you're a trader, right, this is where all these like systems like Jito runs ShredStream, Triton runs their own version of it, Helios just launched their own version of it. If you're a trader, you need fresh data. You need the tip of the chain block by block as it comes in. And there's no way you can get that. So what do? You pay for it. And suddenly, the trader who's willing to pay for access to fresh data has a systemic advantage over the trader who's just sitting in their basement grinding away trying to make a buck. That dynamic is exactly what we got rid of in TradFi. The idea that, I am systemically disadvantaged against jump trading. On every level, there's no way around that. The promise of DeFi and the promise of blockchain was that as long as you can afford that base layer of access, the ability to run a node, you should be able to compete with the best traders in the world if you're smarter than them. Today on chain, that's not really the case because state is propagated out at differential rates depending on how much of an asset you own. And so the promise of what we can do with multicast and what we can do with DoubleZero in general is level the playing field and make it possible for everyone to compete where they get state. Everyone in the same data center gets state at the same time. So we have geographic fairness of state distribution. And then when you're trying to trade back, your trade server says, okay, great, I have this opportunity to trade. I need to run it as fast as possible to the leader. Well, if the leader's on DoubleZero and your sender's on DoubleZero and Jump sitting right next to you in the data center with their trade server and you both send data, as long as your data is sent sooner, it'll arrive faster than Jump's. And that's not the case today when you talk about non-DoubleZero networks, is that you have people who have bought certain types of prioritized routes and they have that and they use that to their advantage. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but we should try and create more fairness in systems when we can.
And it's not about redistributing the pie.
Yeah.
We were just talking about this earlier. It's about making the pie bigger. So someone asks, well, who's the winner and who's the loser when DoubleZero? No, everyone wins. That's our goal. Our goal is to make the pie bigger and make everyone win, the whole ecosystem more valuable, the blocks more profitable for everybody. And that's how everyone wins together. Now you might ask, okay, well, why is that a differentiator? Why can't I do this on the public internet? And I want to explain that to you. I want to try to do it super fast and super simple. But basically, it's a coordination problem. And when I first came into blockchain and people said, this is basically a coordination problem that we're solving, I was super happy. I was like, this is where I want to be. I want to solve coordination problems because coordination problems are the hardest thing in legacy systems. Yeah. If you look at legacy telecom billing, if you look at any type of legacy system, you're like, why is it so hard? It's because of coordination. So in the case of the internet, all of these internet service providers that make up the internet, thousands and thousands and thousands of them, would need to coordinate with each other so that when I send a packet on multicast, I need to tell this other ASN number. Each ISP has an autonomous system number. I need to tell that person's address on the internet that I have a packet coming, but I'm only going to send it once. And if the next switch that it's going to is on their network, then they just need to replicate it once and send it there. But if it's not on their network, they need to go find out what network it's on and then see if they have to send it to 2 other places. And it's an impossible coordination problem to solve. And so multicast doesn't work on the public internet. People have tried. There's all kinds of protocols that have tried to make it work, but there's no way to make it work at this level of performance or really even at all. And so that's why it's important to have a single ASN network overlay that's decentralized with multiple parties contributing to that network, but allowing blockchains like Solana and other performant blockchains to have this really important weapon in the trading war. I mean, the trading war is like, who's going to bring the volume, the liquidity to this one ecosystem? And that is very hard to do. And if you don't have the big guns, you're not going to be able to do it. So multicast is one of those big guns.
So are we getting rid of stake weight quality of service on Solana?
So I think stake weighted QoS is something that was supposed to be an option for validators, and it became a requirement for transaction senders. And so if a validator wants to use the stake weight of the sender as one of the methods by which it decides if it should pack a transaction to a block, who am I to tell them they shouldn't do that? However, what happened instead was you had to be sending through a staked node, proxying through a staked node in order to actually get inclusion in a block for a long time. And that was bad. That was basically, we took something that was meant to be an optional flag on if the sender is high quality or the sender is low quality, and it became a institutionalized systemic advantage for those who had more soul.
Yeah, this was...
So...
I didn't know multicast gave everybody the data at the same time, which is super cool.
Yes.
Because that was one of my...
Now, I have to clarify. The same time if they're connected to the same switch. We can't break physics, right? So it's still... The time to get from New York to London is less than New York to Singapore. But everyone in the New York data center gets it at the same time. Everyone in the Singapore data center gets it at the same time.
It's really cool, though. I was thinking about... all this makes it's a little bit easier, I guess, if you're co-located, which I guess is why people have historically done it in the past. But I think the goal is using decentralization to your advantage to actually ingest these points of information where something does happen and changes in the world, and then use decentralization more as an advantage, and then how do you get that information to the rest of the quorum or the people that want that information with multicast? Super cool, because that was something that I was thinking about is the priority of the data is very important. It's not only like the data inclusion, it's like where and who gets this data first. I think Tully's Two Coffee and a Beer is always talking about someone front run my trade, and I didn't want to be front run. So it's cool that multicast is kind of the solution there.
Yeah, it's all this stuff is pretty cool, but it's also nothing new. I want to keep saying that. Like, we're literally not doing anything new except combining these two worlds. We're combining the performant infrastructure world with the crypto blockchain software world. And that's really the main piece of value that I think that's happening here.
Yeah, I mean, and to be fair, like, that is what the cloud providers did.
Yeah.
Right? They combined an existing world of managed servers and data centers with this new crazy concept called internet payments. Yeah. And like the breakthrough for the early cloud was not that you could get 40 servers in a data center. You could always get 40 servers in a data center. It was that you could do it without faxing any papers, calling any person, or waiting a few weeks for them to get installed. You just showed up at a web portal with a credit card, and 30 seconds later, you had 40 servers ready to go.
Yeah.
That's similar to what we're doing with bandwidth, right?
Yes, exactly.
Because, if you've ever... Most of your viewers have never ordered a 100 gig circuit from a service provider. But I will tell you what happens if you try to do that. It is extremely difficult, extremely slow, and extremely expensive. And you have to make a big commitment up front, right? You have to buy hardware that's very expensive. You have to pay an installation fee that's very expensive. And you have to commit to a long-term contract that is also very expensive. And so what we're doing with bandwidth is very similar to what the cloud providers did with compute. Mm-hmm. We are enabling you to do it immediately with no commitment, with no on-ramp, with no upfront CapEx. Just sign up and use it. And when I say sign up, that's automated too. You just download a command and the provisioning is automatic.
By sign up, we mean interact with a smart contract on a blockchain.
Nice.
Exactly.
It is very cool. I think the multicast thing, at least for me, was probably not as well understood. But for the trading specifically, is very interesting. I always knew kind of the more efficient like egress costs, so to speak, but the trading aspect is huge. I do think if blockchains ultimately kind of get to the end state that at least I'm hoping for, it's kind of like you're going from like T+2 in equities down to like a few hundred milliseconds around the world.
Although we have to remember that like the 1-day float in equities is kind of a feature. Like it's basically an interest-free loan for 24 hours.
Until you actually have to like settle the trade.
Yes. And so there is some counterparty risk, but it's also a feature. And so one of the things that is actually going to be I'm really interested to see is there's actually a lot of float and flex in the TradFi system that we sort of think of these things as very defined hard, like a trade is a trade and it's settled. And it's like, it's actually not settled. They get reversed all the time. And bringing the certainty of blockchains is going to be very disruptive to a lot of the incumbent market structures. And so I don't think, when 100% of Solana is running on DoubleZero and when other protocols have adopted it, I don't think we're going to see like NASDAQ on chain in the sense of it like a system operating just like NASDAQ. It just happens to be based on blockchain. We're going to see a much more integrated experience that's going to have a lot of different facets that's going to resemble the end state of something like NASDAQ, but I think will be built in a very different way, which we have a lot of these. The internet is an incumbent system that does its job really well, but it doesn't do tomorrow's job particularly well.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about all the things that the internet has kind of touched in our lives, the financial stack is really one of the last. And so it's cool, especially with making sure that information is really propagated around the world as quickly as possible, as fast as possible. You really need something like DoubleZero.
Yeah.
So I think the broad strokes on trading are kind of covered, but the ambition is not trading. I mean, trading's a feature of DoubleZero, but DoubleZero is much more. So can you talk about the other things that you think people may use DoubleZero for?
Yeah, let me talk about something that nobody talks about, which is resiliency. And the reason that you don't hear about resiliency so much is because there are very few times when things go wrong. But we just had the good fortune or misfortune of having two major problems over the past few weeks. We had the AWS outage and we had the flash crash. And I want to talk a little bit about the resiliency of the DoubleZero network, because when you ask what other things we're going to do, it's always going to be based on performance and resiliency. So we talked a lot about performance. In the resiliency, when you have something like the flash crash that happened a couple weeks ago, we had traffic volumes that were the highest they've been in some aspects in 10 years on Solana in probably, I don't know, a few years, or maybe since January.
Yeah, since
right?
January.
Since January.
Yeah. A few years in crypto.
Yeah, a few years in crypto. And the internet performed pretty poorly during the flash crash. You may have seen, or if you haven't seen, go to x.com/DoubleZero and find the post that we did about how the internet performed during the flash crash.
We'll link it in the show notes.
We'll link it in the show notes. Thank you. And basically what happened is that all of that activity that happened on Solana and on other blockchains created a large amount of congestion and jitter. And it wasn't only coming from blockchains, because the internet serves all of the use cases, right? So a lot of things were happening. A lot of traffic was being exchanged and a lot of congestion happened. We graphed it out and we posted it. And you can see these huge spikes of jitter. Jitter is the variation in the time it takes for a packet to leave one location and arrive at the next location. And so when you're sending a stream of packets that is part of a protocol, an application, whatever, and some are like arriving before others that were supposed to arrive first, and everything's out of order and you have to reorder it. A lot of systems, they just vomit on the floor. Like they just drop everything and like your app goes down, right? Or it just performs really poorly. And so we saw those huge spikes of jitter on the internet during the flash crash. And then we showed the DoubleZero metrics from our systems that you can also check on chain, and you can check in our dashboards, and you could see virtually no jitter, like you can barely even see the colors on the graph, because these are dedicated circuits. It's not rocket science. It's not like we're doing it better. Is our architecture is different. We're not doing it any better than any other dedicated network, but our architecture is different, and we're using wavelengths, optical wavelengths, as the base layer, and they have no jitter at all. And so that really meant that during that event, the blockchain was protected, even though there was only about 30% of the stake of Solana, for example, on the DoubleZero network. That 30% of stake was getting delivered, and those blocks were getting built very efficiently. And so even though it's not a dominant amount of stake yet, it did have a resiliency impact on the flash crash performance of Solana during that event. And so, like, when you think about what other types of application need that level of resiliency, need that level of performance, there are a whole bunch of things. And content delivery is one of those, right? We've talked a lot about how in other sort of conversations like this that I've had, I've talked to how did Netflix do it? How did YouTube do it? Like, they went from like crappy, jittery, buffering video all the way to today's experience, which is ludicrously amazing, right? It's just like right there. Well, what they did is they implemented resilient, high-performance networking to get that done. So content delivery for distributed systems is a very interesting use case for DoubleZero, because right now a lot of those systems can't access disparate content and synchronize it fast enough over a unified network to be able to launch the next generation of applications that rely on content. Same thing in AI. All kinds of AI models in a distributed fashion need synchronization, need low latency networks to be able to work. So it's really, my answer to you is any distributed system that wants high performance.
It's going to actually be a lot of applications. Content delivery networks, I think, are kind of an easier example, but AI kind of booming. I mean, just
Sure.
moving data from one GPU to one GPU now those are generally kind of within kind of one architecture. But if you're start to do things with distributed trading, we'll see how that goes. But even gaming, I mean, you talk about metaverse a little bit early in kind of the pivot even from Facebook, but you can kind of squint and see these things take off in kind of like a 5 or 10 year time horizon. And I think what was it? It was Ready Player One. They talked about like bandwidth riots, where there wasn't enough bandwidth, but maybe if they were running on DoubleZero, they would have enough bandwidth to actually be in the metaverse.
Yeah, this was the thing we kept hearing a lot in the so Toli and I were kicking around the idea of like DoubleZero back in like 2022, and it wasn't DoubleZero back then. It was like just looking at the charts of internet speed versus like Moore's law, and it's like, oh man, the internet is not keeping up at all. Like in New York in 2012, you could get a 1 gigabit connection. Now you can get a 2 gigabit connection. Like in 12 years, we've doubled speed
from the home internet.
From home internet, yeah. And that's not enough, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's like New York is probably like one of the best internet markets in the country. Like most people can get nowhere near that speed, and so it was this question of like, okay, we're set on CPUs, we're set on RAM, we're set on NVMe. What about the connectivity layer? Is the public internet actually going to grow at the speed that blockchain's growing at, or is this gap going to get wider and wider between the theoretical performance of the client and the actual performance of the internet? And what do we do about that gap? We didn't have an answer back then, but now we do.
Yeah, it totally, I think from day one has always been pretty consistent that bandwidth was like the main bottleneck. Which was interesting again because most of the blockchains were talking about kilobytes, and but maybe wrapping it back to kind of like the better products. Austin, you spoke about kind of multi-leader, bringing things on chain quicker. Where do you see, like, if you could like wave your magic wand, like where do you see like the end state of these things? Is it going to be a globally kind of like global exchange? Do you envision this DoubleZero kind of on the backbone of all these CDN networks, or like broadly from like trading to finance to gaming?
Yeah. So I would say right now, we don't see a lot of integration between these disparate systems unless it's through co-location facilities. And so you see a lot of like fintech companies running in the same data centers for pretty obvious co-location benefits there, but they also come with risks. I think what we will see if DoubleZero is as successful as we hope to be is pretty much all major blockchains that aim to be high performance will be operating on DoubleZero. That'll make the interoperability between them much easier. Think about a world where you are an intent-based protocol, or you're a blockchain bridge, or you're just a trader who's trying to do a bunch of stuff between multiple chains. Well, suddenly you subscribe to one multicast feed for all the Solana state transitions. You subscribe to another one for all the Aptos feed, all the SUIs on another one. And suddenly your trade server has perfect observability in real time across all these networks, and also a high performant network to deliver transactions out to the leaders wherever they are. And we bake a bunch of additional technologies into the network to increase fairness, to increase our ability to catch anyone who's trying to cheat, or any network provider that might be doing something nefarious. But at the end of the day, what we build is effectively everybody's private high frequency trading network. And it really is about leveling the playing field there and allowing these systems to operate at 10 to 100 to 1,000 times the capacity they can currently operate at. I mean, if you look at like the data rate per second on DoubleZero, the testnet of DoubleZero can support 8+ Solanas, let alone the mainnet. Now, you have to get multicast for that to actually have all those bandwidth multiplication savings effects. But if we look at like the Fire Dancer demo from 2024 in Singapore that showed 1 million transactions per second on, I think it was 8 nodes on 4 continents, that was running on the alpha version of the DoubleZero network. We didn't announce it at the time because we hadn't announced DoubleZero as a project, but that's what is possible in like a laboratory setting, September of 2024. We're now in October of 2025, and we have 30% of the Solana network running on DoubleZero. We have about 2.2 terabits per second of total available bandwidth on the network. That can handle orders of magnitude faster network throughput than we currently see from Solana.
What is the main thing to ultimately get like the network performance or the magic number? And is it 2/3?
No, it's entirely up to the protocol developers.
Okay.
So we have no ability to change the limits in Solana. That's obviously up to Solana governance and Anza and Jito and Fire Dancer and Solana Foundation and everyone who works on that. There's a few interesting SIMDs pending. One is, can we remove CU limits entirely from blocks and
That'd be great.
let validators build as big blocks as they can? Well, suddenly DoubleZero becomes pretty interesting in that situation, because now, as quickly, if you can get the data to a leader, the leader can include it. That's pretty interesting because that brings latency into a much more important component of transaction deliverability and performance. Another one is, can we start shrinking block times? Alessandro was tweeting today about how he wants to take Solana down to 200 millisecond block times, and like, bring it on. Like, let's get even lower than that. And then the next big components come from adding things like the FPGAs into the network to do filtration, to do like DDoS protection and mitigation, to potentially start doing what Mateo was talking about high performance timestamping for very specific types of applications. There's a huge amount that we can do. But at the end of the day, we are not building a validator client. Our expertise is not in that high level of the software stack. It's much lower down in the stack. It's the physical hardware and the low-level software systems. And so all of this infrastructure that's been built, all this infrastructure that's available, it is for whoever wants to use it. And so, our belief is and everything we've seen from Solana is they're extremely excited about embracing this and using this technology to go faster than the public internet allows. They're not the only blockchain that's thinking about this. And so we expect to see a myriad of different systems, both on-chain systems as well as off-chain systems, taking advantage of what DoubleZero can offer, both in terms of total throughput and low latency and all these things we've been talking about, but also soon in terms of reachability, because those same factors about to go full circle here, the Miami data center here that we all visited today, that became the hub that it is because it has all this connectivity coming into it. What if we could do that in every city in the world? And so you have these nodes in every city, as opposed to there being 4 or 5 or 6 of these nodes, there's dozens and hundreds of these nodes, all which have access to all high-performance blockchains, fast connectivity to all centralized exchanges. Suddenly, this becomes a very interesting proposition.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, ultimately, we started the industry at kilobytes, and now we're talking about terabytes of throughput. So
yes.
It's great.
And terabytes are still pretty small for the high-speed networks.
Can we go past terabytes?
Sure.
Really? That'd be cool.
Now, give it a few years, but like when look at what is like Web 2 scale for these systems. Like the biggest numbers, our biggest pipe dreams that we throw up, 1 million transactions per second, Shelby doing 10 petabytes of storage. These are very small numbers for people who actually run like Google networks and Amazon networks and AWS.
Yeah.
Like, even when we're talking about the AI models, right? Like the numbers we are looking at is like 1 million transactions per second. It's like, oh great, that's like a NASDAQ. There are 8 global exchanges that do that number of transactions per second.
Yeah.
So we really need to be thinking the ambition of this industry is still too small. Solana needs to stop talking about 1 million transactions per second, start talking about 10 million transactions per second.
I agree. When I first came into the industry, I started asking about, coming from Tesla, about like daily active users and revenues, and everybody looked at me funny. I'm glad that we're now talking a little bit more about revenues, but it's also making sure the infrastructure can actually scale to mass adoption. And I think that was the other thing that really frustrated me coming into the industry was, if you pick the wrong chain, unfortunately, like your product got product market fit, like CryptoKitties, and then like the blockchain kind of fell over. Now with kind of the myriad of high throughput blockchains, at least you know that most likely the blockchain will scale and has a very credible path to continue scaling. Solana now with DoubleZero. Throughput hopefully will no longer be the bottleneck. Hopefully we can remove the compute limits and keep scaling blockchains. But yeah,
and then we'll find new limits. Like this is for years the problem was the software.
Yep.
Right. Like you ran Geth locally in 2018. Good luck getting it above 300 transactions per second.
Yeah.
The problem, our whole purpose here is to make it the software people's fault again.
No, I do think I would like impress on the listener or watcher. It's just how hard it is to get all these point-to-point connections that you have gotten contributed to the DoubleZero network. That is very hard. And these are like actual fiber lines running across the ocean generally. These are not easy tasks, and generally these fiber lines are hundreds of millions or more dollars to actually spin up, and you guys have access to them and are running these blockchain and other applications on top of them. So kudos to you. I know you guys don't tweet as much, or Mateo specifically. Austin, you like tweeting, which I appreciate. But I appreciate broadly that you guys ship more than you kind of like hype up projects, especially within crypto. It's normally the inverse, where you talk about how great everything is and then maybe eventually ship a product. So I appreciate you guys building and pushing this here to actually scale the industry.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, we've created a team of like hardcore builders. That's our DNA. That's our belief system. That's our religion, is build high quality stuff that people can really use. And we're just happy we have like Austin and Eden and a few other people to like help us communicate that. But at the core, we're a building organization.
I love it. Anything that we miss or you want to dive deeper on?
No, I'm just having fun. Like I just want to thank you, crypto guys, for allowing us into the industry. It's super fun. It's super authentic. People are great, and like there's the constant debate makes us better. It really makes us better. Like there's too much quiet out in the normal world, right? It's like there's not enough debate, and in crypto I found like everyone challenges you, everyone debates your ideas, and so that just makes us all better, and I'm just having a great time, having a blast here.
There are lots of debates. You can get debates until your heart desires. It is helpful to kind of challenge your thinking, but I also appreciate kind of not the outsider perspective, just a different point of view where you're not kind of stuck in some of the crypto nativeness, because I do think the people that have historically scaled systems have obviously thought a lot about that underlying infrastructure, and now that's being brought to blockchains. I think it's cool to see what Sui's doing, what Aptos is doing, just because those engineers historically have built systems at scale as well. And so, if anything, I just want to see better products, and I appreciate you guys pushing the forefront there and ultimately enabling more scale so engineers can build even more expressive applications. Because at the end of the day, the tech is cool, our religions are cool, but people have to use these products, and that's the thing that gets me the most excited. So
bring in the builders.
Yes.
Let's go.
Let's do it. Perfect. Well, appreciate it again, gentlemen. Thanks for hosting me here in Miami.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.